درود به مردم شریف ایران. من شهریار افشار هستم، میزبان شما در برنامه Politics 365. امروز یک مهمان به برنامه ما برگشته، پیوسته از فلوریدا استیت یونیورسیتی، دکتر اریک لاب. ایشون یک کارشناس و پروفسور موضوعات خاورمیانه و سیاسی هستش و قبلا به برنامه ما پیوسته بود در مورد ایران و چند تا موضوعات خاورمیانه. ایشون صاحب نظرن و به ما خیلی کمک کردن که بیشتر آگاهی پیدا کنیم در این موضوعی که همیشه در ایران هر هفته یه موضوع جدیدی پیش میاد و ما واقعا کمک لازم داریم از اکادمیکا و پروفسورهای دانشگاه که به ما کمک کنن که بیشتر واقعا بتونیم این موضوعا رو بیشتر درک کنیم و یه موضوعی که واقعا تو CNN و شبکه‌های عمومی زیاد پخش نمیشه و وقت نیست که توش به اصطلاح واقعا آدم بجور و بیشتر آشنایی باشیم پیدا کنه. مجددا میخواستم بگم هر موقع میخواستیم ما تماس بگیرین میتونین به وبسایت ما مراجعه کنین، politics365.com. روی یوتیوب چنل هم یه دونه داریم، همون ویدیوهایی که این همین برنامه اینجا پخش میشه روی رادیو ایران، ویدیوش چند روز بعد توی یوتیوب و وبسایت ما پخش میشه. اگه موضوع رو میخواین ما باهاش به اصطلاح روبرو بشیم و پیگیری کنیم، خواهش میکنم ما تماس بگیرین. میتونید به ایمیل شخصی من هست info@politics365.com. هر سوالی، توصیه، انتقادی دارین ما خوشحال میشیم صدای شما رو بشنویم و پیام شما رو دریافت کنیم که بتونیم جوابای شما رو بدیم. خب بریم دنبال اصل قضیه. دکتر اریک لاب، خوش اومدین به برنامه ما. موضوع این برنامه به انگلیسی البته تهیه شده، اما خب سوال به فارسی میکنم بعد به انگلیسی. واقعا این گروگانایی که تازه آزاد شدن از ایران و اون پول 6 بیلیون دلاری که از کره جنوبی آزاد شد، پول ایران بود اما خب آزاد شد، آمریکا اجازه داد که این پول برگرده به اسکرو اکانت قطر. اما خب حالا میبینیم که واقعا اون چجوری اون اسکرو اکانت مدیریتش چجوری داره اجرا میشه. اما این 5 نفری که آزاد شدن خب ایرانی آمریکایی بودن، مثل خیلی از شما که شاید این برنامه رو گوش میکنین. رفته بودن یا بیزینس داشتن، 1000 تا کار داشتن، فامیل ببینن ایران، یه دفعه دستگیر میشن، چند سال زندانی میشن و الان آزاد شدن. اما خب این موضوع همیشه مثل یه ابر سیاه روی هر ایرانی که میره ایران و ویزیت میکنه کشور خودش رو هست که ممکنه بدون هیچ دلیلی یه دفعه ایران شما رو دستگیر کنه و بمونین همونجا زندان که تا کشور شما، لندن، میگم انگلیس، آمریکا، کانادا، بره برای شما سعی کنه واسطه بشه و یه جوری آزادی شما رو بخره. اصل موضوع اینه. So, sorry Eric, I had to explain a lot about, of course our listeners know all this stuff, but I just have to state the obvious, which is, you know, any Iranian that goes to Iran for good purposes, see family, do business, whatever is legally allowed, can get entangled in some international intrigue and get arrested for no reason and be used as a political pawn. And in this case, apparently worth $1 billion per prisoner, you know, which kind of just proves beyond a reasonable doubt that whatever charges they were arrested for was nonsense. Because if there is, as we say in this country, we're a nation of laws, okay, whether it's the president's son in this country or somebody, a former president, you know, the law will deal with it, and we have this checks and balances between Congress and the legislative and the executive. But in Iran, it's all one big political blob that is only designed to preserve itself and its ideology or its power structure and not respect the law. So whatever legal premise they were arrested with apparently was nonsense, because they could simply be freed without any kind of discretionary free. So I guess I would like your thoughts about how you saw this exchange. What are the implications really in Iran and the Middle East and U.S.-Iran relations? And we'll go from there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And I mean, where do I start? Of course, as you said, this deal was publicly consummated back I believe a month or so ago in August is when it started leaking. And then it was actually more recently implemented last week when we started to see the Iranians who arrived in Qatar, as well as the Iranian Americans who were released arriving there, and then of course the 5 Iranians who were released from the United States. Some arriving, I believe, in Qatar, others choosing not to go back to Iran and staying here or going elsewhere. And so, there's a lot to sort out here. The selling point of this deal, and of course, this deal really comes in the wake of collapsed indirect talks over, to efforts to revive the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal, which really collapsed in the spring and summer of 2022. And then after that, there were attempts at back channel talks, perhaps limiting their ambitions to just a prisoner exchange and to the unfreezing of assets in South Korea that, of course, were tied to Iran's oil export revenues. And so this deal did come to fruition, right? It was, let's say, maybe more manageable, given that it was more limited in scope than sanctions relief in exchange for nuclear restrictions that you see with the JCPOA. That involves the P5+1. Although here, this was still very complicated because you had 3 different intermediaries at the very least that we know about, which is Switzerland, Oman, Qatar. And so, even a deal as on the surface that could be seen as simple as an exchange of prisoners or hostages or the release of assets still is very complicated. Still involved a lot of actors, a lot of months apparently of negotiations. Even the way that these, once the prisoners were put under house arrest and released, that was relatively straightforward. But now looking at what is going to happen with these assets, right? They went from South Korea to Switzerland and now to Qatar. As you mentioned, in an escrow account. They're supposed to be used strictly for humanitarian purposes, i.e. food or medicine and other humanitarian goods for the population, not for the government, for military or geopolitical purposes. The question is, is that realistic? Is that really going to come to fruition? Even the UN oil for food program that we saw with Iraq was very controversial and had some issues. So from an academic perspective, I know this could be very emotional for people that believe in greater engagement with this regime or not engaging with this regime, that this was somehow a payoff to a regime that did not deserve this. Whatever side of the fence you're on, academically, at least for me, it'll be interesting to see how this actually really gets done in the end. Realistically, through Qatari financial institutions and vendors, can you really strictly channel these assets into humanitarian goods, or are they going to somehow find their way into the coffers or the pockets, let's say, of institutions or individuals affiliated with the regime?
No, it's true. I think there are a lot of skeptics around the entire structure of the deal. No one has any confidence that Qatar will do everything correctly. And even if they do, no one has any confidence that the Iranian government will submit the correct paperwork. I mean, there's all kinds of ways, especially in the Middle East. I mean, look, I think the Middle East invented some of these bureaucratic, corrupt practices. I don't know what else you can say. Lots of good things come from the Middle East, of course, and but this way of bureaucracy and corruption and getting around the legal structure of things is just the way Iran does business. And I think the other aspect is Qatar being a tiny, country kind of beholden to a superpower, across the Gulf. They're not going to want to do things to upset the sleeping bear. In every way. All the smaller Arab countries around the Gulf, they find ways to pay homage to the regime because they don't want to make an enemy out of the regime. So, I think in all intents and purposes, that $6 billion are now in an Iranian bank. So it is what it is, and it's Iranian oil revenues, yes, but it kind of makes me think, what other frozen assets, how many other billions are frozen in other countries based on the sanctions? This was, I mean, we heard a lot about this 6 billion with South Korea. I don't know where else is frozen. Are you aware of any? Is it a global freeze, or was it just South Korea, as far as you know?
I mean, frankly, I mean, I would assume that there's billions, elsewhere.
Right.
European countries, the United States, and elsewhere. And you have debates in terms of what can you do with these assets. For example, if there's a court case against Iran, can you use these assets to reward the victims of the case?
Right.
Or the defendants, or let's say the prosecution, can you award them these assets? And I'm not, frankly, sure, or an expert on the intricacies of all that.
Right.
But again, I think you make an important point that critics of this deal have made. I mean, again, the selling point for the Biden administration is you can't argue against bringing Americans home, right? That's patriotic. That's the duty of the responsibility of the U.S. government to do. But on the flip side, critics of this deal would say that this incentivizes Iran and even other, so-called rogue nations or pariah states to continue these practices and to extract, more assets, or to use them as pawns, as you said earlier, for other geopolitical purposes. So, it sends perhaps adverse signals, let's say, in that area. And it's interesting because this transaction, or this deal, coincided with the UN General Assembly meeting last week, and our assembly meeting last week in New York, where President Raisi was invited. And the U.S. didn't say much about Iran. When you listen to the speech of President Biden, just that that the U.S. is not going to allow Iran to weaponize its nuclear program, but that's about the furthest that they said. But for Iran, again, it was the brazenness, let's say, that President Raisi infused his speech with, in terms of that these were Iranian assets, as you said earlier. These are our assets. We're entitled to do what we want with them. So, as you said, or as you implied, I mean, thinking that the Iranians may respect, these constraints on the assets for humanitarian purposes may be far-fetched. Not to mention blaming the U.S. for the protests and other issues that Iran's dealing with. And I think the last thing is it's very valid what you say in terms of how the Qataris are going to handle this, because they've already seen other Arab Gulf states, GCC states, being on the front lines, culminating with the drone and missile attack on the Saudi oil facilities of Abqaiq and Horeis in 2019, which has prompted the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others to engage with Iran and try to dial down tensions to avoid those types of attacks. Not to mention, being close to Yemen and the Houthis and their capabilities. So there's a lot to think about here, and you could see the deal from both sides. The strengths, but also the numerous shortcomings of it.
Right, and I'm not saying this like you explained. There were 3 different intermediaries. It was very difficult. Even if the U.S. had a embassy in Iran, I don't know if that's why it happened, because they felt, well, we don't have a relationship with the Americans. We can do anything we want. I don't know if they've grabbed any British citizens. There's the British have a very active embassy in Iran, and in fact, their ambassador was on social media recently, speaking perfect Farsi. It's very impressive for a Brit. But so definitely they're taking advantage of the fact that we have no relationship. I'm not saying this is a scenario where if you had relations, maybe this wouldn't happen. But somehow the Brits, a democratic U.S. ally, have been able to tolerate Iran and all of its human rights issues and all of the issues that no closer ally, we say every time the Prime Minister of England gets together with the U.S. president, they hold hands and they take photographs, and no closer ally, and yet one of our closest allies has this relationship with Iran, which has got to be puzzling. How can they tolerate Iran and the US can't? I guess the question. And I didn't see 5 Brits being grabbed for $1 billion release. It was Americans or Iranian Americans. So this may not end. This is not the end. This is just a process that we're observing. I know a lot of people see milestones and they react to these milestones, and outrage, of course, over all of those things we just talked about. But tomorrow, somebody else could be grabbed for all kinds of other reasons. And we're back at this again because, like you say, whether it's Iran or another country, they've been incentivized that Americans are worth about $1 billion. And even if it's not fresh money, it's your own assets. Or if you've got some assets tied up somewhere in some U.S. allied bank, this is how you get it out, right? Unfortunately. What do you see, especially with Raisi's visit, and of course we saw to the UN, and Biden, as you said, didn't mention Iran other than the standard political line, which has been the case with, I don't know, some 30 years. I think that's been the same American policy. We're not going to let Iran get a nuclear bomb. Okay, fine. That's kind of where it stops. They kind of keep, but they never integrate democracy or human rights or any of those other issues that are important to the diaspora in their political speeches, right? They give Grammys to an Iranian, musician. They do other social media puff pieces. Have a Iranian Persian New Year at the White House, but they don't change policy. In the couple of minutes we have left, I mean, what scenario would have to take place for the U.S. to change its policy?
So, there's been critiques actually in the academic and even policy community about what is the U.S. strategy with Iran moving forward. This move was seen as something very tactical, let's say, but really, what is the overarching strategy is the big question mark. And on the one side, of course, some would say that U.S.-Iran relations, and even sometimes lumping the Europeans in, although, as you said, it might be more nuanced on the European side, have never been worse, despite this incremental deal that we saw take place recently. And so, the question is will there be a dialing down in the wake of this of U.S.-Iran tensions? On the one side, we've seen that since this deal was made, the Iranians have put restrictions on their nuclear program. But then on the flip side, they just expelled IAEA inspectors. So, it's one step forward, another step back. Apparently, they've also communicated to their partners and proxies in the region to not target U.S. assets for the time being. But of course, there's other contentious issues. There's the issues with the tankers, which in response, the U.S. has increased its military presence. There's the support for the Russians with drones and missiles in Ukraine, and of course the protests and potentially, like you said, more hostage taking in the future. So we're really at a crossroads, and I don't see the U.S. taking any bold moves heading into election season in 2024. Perhaps if Biden were to win a second term, as what happened to Obama, you might see perhaps efforts to revive the JCPOA or maybe something else if they want to think outside the box, if that agreement has not died at this point. The problem is, the Iranians on their side don't necessarily see that the U.S. can have a long-term strategy given election cycles, changes in administration, given that no guarantees could be made, just as what happened. You signed the JCPOA in 2015, you pull out of it in 2018. If you have a Republican administration, you would probably have a more hostile administration towards Iran. So, there's just a lot of uncertainty surrounding that relationship.
That seems to be the case always with Iran. So thank you so much, Eric Lobb, for joining us. I really appreciate you. And please, we're going to keep checking back with you every time something happens in Iran. There's never a shortage of issues, unfortunately. And of course, we all want the best for the people of Iran. But unfortunately, we just have to deal with all these geopolitical issues that impact ordinary people that have nothing to do with politics, that their lives are impacted by all these big deals that happen. So thanks again, Eric Lobb. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. I have a feeling we'll be speaking again very, very soon.
Thank you.